Hi everyone, and welcome to Festival for Change. Hi everyone, I'm Greta and I'm from Italy. I'm currently living in London and I'm a university student. Today's talk will be very exciting, so please add your question in the chat. I'm honored to be with Jeremy today, and Jeremy is a writer and campaigner for environmental and social justice. He wrote at the Earthbound Report, and he's the author of Climate Change is Racist and co-author of The Economics of Arrival. Jeremy has worked on projects with Oxfam and RSPB. He's a co-founder of the Post-Growth Institute, and he grew up in Madagascar and Kenya, and now he lives in Luton. And now I will give the floor to Jeremy.
Thank you. Yes, so I wrote this book this year called Climate Change is Racist. And it looks at the intersection of these two very big issues that are kind of defining our century in many ways, of climate change and racial inequalities. And that's not something that we often talk about, certainly not in circles that I move in when we talk about climate change. And when I first kind of realized that there was a racial dynamic to climate change, I hadn't ever heard anyone say that before. And so I went looking for books that were about that, and I couldn't find any. And so I ended up writing the book that I wanted to read, essentially. And what I came across is actually that lots of people had talked about climate change and race already, just I hadn't come across them. But for me, the defining moment when I saw the racial dynamic to climate change was when I saw these two graphs side by side. And I want to show them to you in a slightly redrawn fashion from the ones I saw. But the first one, you've probably seen something like this before. I'll do it the old-fashioned way and show you on a piece of cardboard. There we go. This is a map of carbon emissions per capita, and it tells you the countries that have the highest carbon emissions per person. And as you can see, there's the countries in red have the highest emissions, and then the countries in green have the lowest emissions here. And you have this very big and very distinctive north-south divide going on there. Now, if we compare that to the second one, which shows climate vulnerability, and here, the colors kind of reverse. So the countries that were in green before are now in red, and the ones that were in red are in green. And what that tells you is that the countries that have the highest carbon footprints are often the least vulnerable to climate change, and the countries that have made the smallest contribution to the problem are often the most vulnerable. And when we look at this we look at it with different perspectives. We can see that there's a north-south divide there. That's a matter of geography, really, that climate change is going to be more serious in countries that are already hot. We also see that there's a rich and poor divide there, that there are richer countries who are well placed to protect themselves from climate change and who are going to be able to sort of pay their way out through things like air conditioning if it gets too hot. But we also, if we look at this map, see a racial divide, because there's no getting away from the fact, really, that those countries that we see in green there have majority white populations, and the countries that are most affected by climate change have majority black and brown populations. And this is borne out in other studies. There's a report called the Climate Vulnerability Monitor, which estimates that 80% of the economic damage from climate change will fall on the global south, and 99% of the mortality. Now, global north and global south doesn't divide along racial lines, it's not supposed to, but if we're talking about 99% mortality, we're basically looking at 99 deaths of people of color to one white person. As a white person, I find that quite stunning, quite a stunning injustice, really. And it's something that I wanted to talk about and highlight more and to discuss more, because it is an unfamiliar aspect of the climate change debate. So in the book, I look at where this injustice comes from, and I think it comes very much from our historical context. So climate change is not unfolding in a neutral world, it's unfolding in the context of history, and therefore in the context of all sorts of historical injustices, including colonialism, and before that, slavery. And all those things feed into global inequalities that then play out at things like COP26 in Glasgow recently, where we see the richest countries get their way for the 26th year in a row at a climate conference, and the poorer countries and their specific needs are kind of at the bottom of the agenda. So I think that there's this racial dynamic to climate change. It unfolds in all sorts of different ways, but it's not for me to talk about. I'd be interested in your questions and on seeing where you want to take that conversation this morning.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And yes, please, if you have some question, add your question in the chat. So I have actually one question for you. So you're talking about racial injustice. So I was wondering, how is the racial injustice of climate change linked to the poverty and global inequality?
Yes. So one of the things that people ask quite often when I talk about this is the real issue here actually poverty? And the truth is that they are intimately connected. We know that there's this very big rich and poor divide in climate change. But if we kind of unpick that question a little bit, then we ask, well, why are some countries poor? And then you end up back in the same colonial dynamics, and some countries have been treated almost as sites of extraction. These are countries that we take things from. And I think if we look at climate change in the context of history, then richer countries, majority white countries, former colonial powers, have basically taken people under the age of slavery, and then we've taken land and resources under the age of colonialism, and now we're taking the atmosphere. But it's always the same people doing the taking and the same people who are being exploited. And there's kind of an ugly continuity there across history.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy. We have a question. It's from Henry, and he asks, how do you find different people respond to your perspectives?
Yes, so the book has been out for 5 or 6 months. So I'm sure there are perspectives out there that I haven't heard yet, and I'm looking forward to having more discussions, especially in person as we're able to go out, post-pandemic. But so far, responses have been really interesting. Usually when I give talks, people can recognize that there is that racial dynamic to climate change. The bigger questions are around why and around what we do about it. And that's where it gets more controversial. There are some people who've taken against it. The people who take against it with most anger are people who deny that climate change is real in the first place. So then it becomes another reason to get angry about climate change. Now you're being told off for being white as well, and they get very angry about it. But I'm always very clear that this is not a book that's supposed to make people feel guilty. What's the point of making people trying to feel guilty? It's a book about taking responsibility for injustice. And as writing it as a white man, I'm very aware that I come from a position of privilege in this whole debate. I haven't experienced racism myself, certainly not structural racism. And so for me, it's a way of taking responsibility for that injustice and working out what we can do about it to make it better. And there's a whole discussion around that. But overall, people have been very positive, and I've been quite surprised and pleased about that people are willing to have the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ari, for your question. And you use the phrase calamity privilege on your book. What is calamity privilege from your experience and your point of view?
Well, as I was researching racism and different theories around race, which is not my area of expertise, I'm very much, I know lots about climate, but very little about race, and I had to do a huge amount of reading to catch up. And one of the big theories that we come across a lot is the idea of white privilege, the idea that as white people don't experience racism, and so for them it's kind of invisible, and so we have the privilege of not having to worry about race. Mm-hmm. And I realized that many of the same dynamics are also true of climate change. That if you grow up in a country like Britain, which is a temperate climate in the global north, you don't have the same experiences of climate change. And so it's very easy to think that it's not an emergency, it's not serious, because you live in a part of the world that's not affected. And that's what I mean by climate privilege. You have the luxury of not having to worry about climate change. Like you say, I grew up in Madagascar.
Yeah.
The south of Madagascar at the moment is in the middle of a famine. There are 4 places in the world that have a famine at the moment. 3 of them are conflict zones, and Madagascar is the 4th, and it's a climate change famine. Possibly the first, full-blown climate change-induced famine. If you live in the south of Madagascar and you come to understand climate change, you know it's an emergency. You know it's serious. And you know that something has to be done urgently. But in a place like Britain, or in parts of Scandinavia, for example, or places like New Zealand, climate change does feel very serious. And so our privilege protects us. And so by understanding that we are some of the lucky ones in that sense, we can make space for those who are experiencing climate change as something much more life and death and a real matter of survival.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Harry. Would you say that the COP26 refusal to really engage with compensation for damage caused is racist?
I think there is a real racial dimension to that. It's very difficult to say, this is racist or that is racist, because it's such a loaded term. And I think it's important to distinguish between the different types of racism. So, quick detour before I answer the question. Often when we talk about racism, what we mean is racial prejudice. So people who are prejudiced against people of color. And I don't think that COP26 is an example of that kind of racism necessarily, though some might disagree with me there. There are other kinds of racism. There's institutional racism, where institutions fail to deliver a standard of service to people of color because of different injustices. And then, of course, over the top, you get structural racism, where racism is deeply embedded in global structures. And I think we can certainly see institutional and structural racism involved in COP26 and in the UN processes, altogether. We know, for example, that you can hear the stories from activists who were there in Glasgow of being excluded from the room, discussions that are made, behind closed doors, powerful politicians from rich countries doing backroom deals, it's essentially excluding some voices and prioritizing others. And particularly with the matter of compensation at COP26, we know that there are countries that are really suffering from climate change right now, like Madagascar, but many others, small island states in particular. Climate change is something that they've contributed very little to, and it is in a sense being done to them. So it's almost like an act of violence. And I have a chapter in the book that discusses climate change as violence. If it's being done to them, then they deserve to be compensated for that damage. And that's a conversation that the rich countries really don't want to have, because it makes them responsible, it makes them liable, and they're worried that perhaps they're going to be sued in future for climate change damage. They will talk about funding adaptation, and this is where I think it gets a bit more ugly, because rich countries are happy to give money to poor countries to help them adapt, although not as much as they've promised yet. But if you're giving money to people to help them adapt, then you're the benefactor, you're the heroic, generous benefactor who's helping them to adjust to this global crisis. If you're paying compensation for damage, you're accepting that you caused it, and you're not the hero of that story anymore. You're the villain. You're accepting that you've caused this damage. And that's the conversation we won't have. I think there is a very serious racial dynamic to that, given that it is people of color and majority black and brown countries that are asking for that money for compensation, and it is majority white countries that have caused those emissions and are causing that damage. And I don't know whether it's helpful to talk about that in those terms or not. Some people tell me it is, some people tell me it isn't. But I think we have to ask the question. And this conversation about compensation for damage is going to roll on for decades to come. And at some point, I think there do need to be reparations.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Ari, for your question. As a woman, I was wondering, we know that women are disproportionately affected by climate change. So is race one of the multiple forms of climate injustice?
Yes, well, this is an interesting thing. So when you look at how race intersects with climate change, you realize that it's basically a multiplier of any kind of disadvantage. So it's true that climate change disproportionately affects women, it disproportionately affects children and older people, and there are all sorts of other groups that are also affected. For example, nomadic communities versus settled communities, or coastal communities versus communities inland. There are all sorts of different ways that climate change makes things harder for people who are already on the margins. And that plays out in different ways in different countries. So because I grew up in Africa, I always have an interest in how these things work out in Africa. And one example of how climate change affects women is it's often women who are doing the household work while men are doing paid employment. And so it's often girls who have to walk to fetch water, for example. If you're in a drought situation, if rivers are drying up, you're going to have to walk further for water. And it's directly making a difference to the lives of those girls. If they're having to spend more time doing those sorts of chores, there's less time for things like education, which is often very fragile anyway for girls in some places. So just little things like that. I read about one situation where because of the culture of modesty, girls weren't taught how to swim, but boys were.
Okay.
And then a flood arrives, the boys can swim, they can get themselves to safety, and the girls can't. And you think it's such a small thing in some ways, but all of a sudden it has implications when you add climate change into that picture. And it's like that with any kind of disadvantage, depending on the culture. In India, it's very much about the caste system, for example. The lower caste people are much more vulnerable to climate change. In some countries, people who identify as gay, who are the LGBTQ communities, are very marginalized. They're not part of, they're rejected by their own families sometimes, by their own communities. And so that they now find themselves marginalized. And when disaster strikes, they are more vulnerable. So climate change is this strange extra danger on top of all these other injustices that we already have. That shouldn't surprise us when we think of climate change in that way, because any kind of disaster works that way. We can see exactly the same thing happening with COVID-19.
Yes.
Along comes a global pandemic. Anyone who's already marginalized in some way has to face an increased risk from COVID-19 in exactly the same way.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Nicolette. How can the northern countries take active responsibility without taking the blame for them, and thereby avoid device narratives around the problem which are not helpful in finding solution? Thank you, Nicolette.
Yes, thank you, Nicolette. That is an interesting question because we're not very good at having honest conversations about race or about things like empire and colonialism and the legacy of those things. And one of the reasons it's difficult is because of this issue of blame. I wasn't around in the colonial times. I wasn't responsible for, Britain taking over other countries and taking what they wanted from them and stealing their treasures and putting them in the British Museum. So in a sense, I understand why people want to be defensive about those things. It feels wrong for me to somehow have to take responsibility for that. And so I'm very clear in the book that taking responsibility doesn't mean taking the blame. I was born into a society in which people who are racialized as white are privileged and people of color don't have those same privileges. I was born into that society. I can't be blamed for that society. But once I've recognized that, I can be held responsible for what I do about that, and whether I work to reduce those inequalities or whether I ignore them and try to protect the privilege that I inherited. That's the nature of privilege. It's not something that we've earned or asked for. It's something that we're born into. But what we do about it is our responsibility. So it's a good question. And the main thing is that we don't let that defensive reaction that we get sometimes derail the debate, because it makes it so uncomfortable. We have to push beyond and say, it's not your fault. You are not guilty of these crimes. It's what we do about it now that we understand it. That's what matters. How do we take responsibility for that?
Thank you. And thank you, Nicole, for your question. So I was wondering, is this climate change local as well as global? Because, for example, Hurricane Katrina affected black neighborhoods more than the white neighborhoods. So,
Yes. Yes, this does play out in local ways as well as global ways. And one of the things that I really drew on as I was working on the book is the environmental justice movement in the States. We don't have an equivalent in Britain, but in the States, there is a well-studied field of research in environmental justice, looking at how particularly Black communities are affected by things like urban air pollution, or the number of Black communities that are located next to toxic waste sites and those sorts of things. You know, going back 50 or 60 years, people have understood that it's often people of color that are inconvenienced by these sorts of by industry and traffic and those sorts of things. So often when you find something like both the production of fossil fuels itself can often divide along racial lines, with communities of color living nearest to things like refineries. Or I have a section in the book that looks at people who live next to the railway tracks where oil trains go through. Oil trains very dangerous. If there's an accident with an oil train in an urban area, that's a disaster, and that has happened in a few places. It is very often poorer neighborhoods, and therefore often people of color who live nearest to those tracks and face that risk. So there's the increased danger from the fossil fuels, and then there's the increased danger from the effect of fossil fuels down the line when natural disasters come along. And Hurricane Katrina is like a classic case study in that. New Orleans is a very diverse city, and it was often some of the Black neighborhoods that were beyond the flood defenses, and so were hit hardest. And then because they were poor neighborhoods and they commanded less political power, less lobbying power, they weren't able to get the political attention that they needed to rebuild afterwards. So, you know, they were hardest hit by the disaster, the last to get help, and then the last to get to be rebuilt. And there are some neighborhoods that never have been rebuilt after Hurricane Katrina, which was 2004, a long time ago now. And still, those communities have never been able to go home. Essentially, they were just displaced. And so we see a racial divide there. If you look at the diversity of New Orleans as a city before and after the disaster, it is now a whiter city because so many Black communities were just never able to come home. So it changed completely. There are local dynamics like that in Britain as well, but they're not very well studied. And I'd love to see more research going into environmental justice in Britain. But I know, for example, that in London, Black residents of London are more likely to breathe more polluted air than white residents because of the dynamics of the city and who has money and who doesn't, and who lives in the nice leafy suburbs and who lives in the city. Yeah.
Thank you. We have one more question from Harry. Do you think the question of climate justice is going to become more silent as we move forward? Thank you, Harry.
Absolutely. I think with climate change, when people first became aware of it, it was scientists that were talking about it, and it was talked about as a scientific thing. It's been about numbers. It's been about parts per million of CO2 and degrees of warming and so on. But the more we've ignored it, and the more we've failed to rise to the challenge of climate change, the more we're dealing with live dangers and real risks and life and death situations and people losing their homes and their livelihoods and even their lives. And all of a sudden, the whole thing becomes much more visible as a justice issue. So, there will be people in Madagascar, children in Madagascar, who will have died today of starvation in that famine because of climate change. And a mile down the road, I can hear right now a plane taking off from Luton Airport. At COP26, Madagascar's environment minister said very specifically, cheap short-haul flights in Western countries, they're cheap for you, but they're not cheap for us. There's a very high cost to these flights. And, I can see that right here. The way that the causes of climate change and the consequences of climate change are so disconnected. that has been an abstract thing in the past, and now it's not. We can see it happening every day in the news. And so climate justice is absolutely going to become more and more important. And I think it's going to be a defining story of the coming century or so.
Thank you. We have one more question from Nicolette. People are in the talking more about climate justice, but policy to operationalize equity consideration into example, climate pledges and are lacking along but way behind this.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think there's growing recognition of some forms of climate justice. So, for example, I've seen the government in Britain talking much more about rich and poor in the run up to COP26. I think they're willing to recognize that there is some economic injustices involved in climate change. I don't think that they're ready to talk about climate change in the racial dynamic yet, or the injustices to do with women or intergenerationally either. I think those things really are lagging behind. And even if you're willing to talk about it, where's the action? Where are the policies? And I think the most important policy, we've mentioned it earlier, came up in Henry's question, is that question of compensation and of reparations. How are we going to make this right? If the actions of richer countries and majority white countries is harming people and is going to continue to harm them in the years to come, how are we going to make that right? Those kind of policies for reparations and compensation are an emerging conversation that we're quite away from having seriously, I think. But it's not going to go away. It's going to keep coming back up.
Thank you, and thank you, Nicolette, for the question. So we're almost at the end of the session, and I was wondering, there is anything else you want to share with us, or maybe some material you can recommend for further reading?
Certainly. Well, I mean, you're welcome to read the book. I wrote it as short as I could. I worked very hard to keep it short. There's lots of material that didn't go in the book because I wanted it to be accessible to everybody. So you can pick this up, and get a good sense of how these things work very easily. It's not a difficult book. If you go to my website, it's called the Earthbound Report, and that's www.earthbound.report. There's a category at the top on climate and race. There's loads of extra resources there, including loads of really good books and papers by people of color talking about race. I have lots of different book recommendations. My favorite book this year is by Vanessa Nakate, who wrote a book called A Bigger Picture. And she's writing as a youth activist in Uganda. And it's just a really helpful perspective from Africa on global climate change. So I definitely recommend Vanessa Nakate's book. But if you go to Earthbound Report, you'll find lots of other things to explore around this whole topic.
Okay, thank you. There is anything else you want to share with us, maybe?
I think just this is a conversation which feels like it's really of its time. Mm-hmm. Because of the whole Black Lives Matter movement that really reached so many more people in 2020, having been going for many years already, but all of a sudden lots of people were talking about it. Having gone from, when I first started working on this book 6 or 7 years ago, really, I couldn't find anyone who was talking about climate change and race. Yeah. Now, all of a sudden, there are books, there are articles, there are campaigns. The global climate strike movement really understands this. It really does feel like a conversation to be having now. And I would welcome anybody to come and talk to me about it some more if you'd like to.
Yeah. So thank you so much to be with us today. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And of course, for more research, you can find Jeremy's book on Bookshop, right? Mm-hmm. And also his personal blog, the Earthbound Report, that you can find also on the comment. So thank you so much to be with us today, Jeremy, and thank you so much for the audience, and thank you so much for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.